Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Personal Finance Reimagined. My name is Jeff Hulett, and I'll be leading a discussion today with one of my favorite people, author and Duke economist and political science professor, Mike Munger. So today's topic is transaction costs in college decision making, maximizing ROI in a super complex choice. And Mike is particularly, well, other than being a college professor, Mike is very focused on what's called transaction costs, and he'll explain what that is in just a little bit. But what I wanted to do is first kind of tee up the discussion before we jump in. And before we even jump into the tee up, one of the things I did want to mention, um, and Mike has a podcast, The Answer is Transaction Costs, and he recently is doing a series on Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. And I am a huge fan of Adam Smith. I'm always careful not to call myself an Adam Smith scholar because I don't rise to that level of knowledge or commitment, but I am certainly very aware of the power of Adam Smith. And after 300-ish years, that the fact that we're still talking about them tells you that he has passed, the test of time, and his Smith's thoughts are more in relevant than ever. But the reason I bring it up is, so Mike, the big challenge to me of Smith is that his work was written 300 years ago during the Enlightenment, and I just find him difficult to read. So whether it be the Theory of Moral Sentiment or Wealth of Nations, it's just tough sledding for normal humans like me. So, like when I think of the work that, say, like Russ Roberts and Dan Klein did when they did the Theory of Moral Sentiments through the Liberty Fund, I don't know if 4 or 5 years ago, that was awesome, and I learned more about the Theory of Moral Sentiment and Adam Smith than I really ever have, and it's really owing to people that take the time to be able to really interpret English, which sounds weird, but it's exactly what I feel like Klein did, and with Russ's help. And then now with you, with your similar sort of, but of course a very Mike Mungerish approach to Adam Smith in a way of thinking, but you're doing the same thing. And I just want to let you know, I appreciate it. I think it's really wonderful. It's a great service. So let's go ahead and jump right into teeing this up. And there's really two big things that I want to tee up before we jump in. First of all, we're going to talk about college decision making. But before we do that, I want to step back and talk a little bit about decision making in general. And actually, we were talking about podcasts, we mentioned Russ Roberts. Russ Roberts wrote a book called Wild Problems a number of years ago. And in it, he talked about wild problems in terms of decision making. And this thinking on decision making is actually somewhat related to that. But basically, the way I'm thinking about it and want to kind of get under the covers of a little bit of is that there are really three major kinds of decisions. We have simple, complex, and super complex. You know, there was a Harvard paper written not long ago where it mentioned that we make over 30,000 decisions today, American adults do, or adults in general do, and which to me was an astounding number. And anybody might go look at that and go, "Oh my God, what are you talking about? Nobody makes that many decisions." But if you really think about what decisions that they were talking about, it's like when we got out of bed this morning, we swung our hips and put our feet on the floor. We may had to make a decision whether we put our left foot first or our right foot first. We walked around our bed. Made a decision to leave our light off because we didn't want to disturb our spouse, but we had to make decisions about how to navigate the room. So those are the simple kind of decisions. So if you think of it in that context, we actually do make lots and lots of decisions all the time. But again, most of them are very simple. Then we go to complex. So in my world of personal finance, I deal mainly in complex decisions. So I teach at James Madison. I teach personal finance. We are teaching complex financial decision making, right? So think of buying a house, buying a car, taking out a credit card, lots of those different typical personal finance decisions. But we also go into getting your first job, whether or not to get a pet, sort of financially impacting decisions that you may not always associate with personal finance. But those are under the general category of complex. They are multi-criteria, multi-alternative decisions. And they are complex. And what makes them complex is we have to make trade-offs. We have to basically build a personal utility function. And we basically trade off different preferences. It's the trading off that is so very difficult. We naturally find that very challenging. And that's basically what I teach in my classes, how to make better trade-offs. And we provide tools to do that. And then, of course, we go into the process, say, if you're buying a car, there could be 1,000 cars you want to buy. So that's where the complexity lies. Okay, so that's complex. But college decision-making and just a handful of others are what I call super complex. Another one is actually getting married would be another super complex decision. And what I'm talking about there is where literally you have all the complex pieces that we just talked about with those financial complex decisions, but this one's a little bit different because what you have to do is say this 17-year-old that has to make a complex decision or a super complex decision like college, they have to get into a time machine. They have to teleport themselves 10 years into the future. Maybe they have a parent with them. Hopefully they do. Maybe they don't. They have to get out their future self, look around, check out what the world looks like in 10 years. They need to report back what kind of person I became, what kind of job I have, where I live, what kind of friends do I have. They learn all that information in their 10-year future world. Then they get back into their time machine and come back to the present and have a conversation with their current self. And that future self informs the current self. And then they go into the the other typical complex parts of, well, which college do I go to? What are my criteria, etc. But it's that kind of teleportation, that need to go into the future, into a future that human beings are horrible at being able to figure out generally. That's the challenge, right? And again, there's not necessarily that many of them, but the ones that there are incredibly difficult. So anyway, what we're going to talk about today is college decision making. There is an irony here that the 17-year-old, and think of the 17-year-old brain, the hormone-soaked, half-closed executive functioning of the 17-year-old brain is basically the beneficial owner of a decision that could have massive life-changing financial implications and certainly has a severity to it if it's done wrong. And there's an irony to that, right? It just seems almost unthinkable that we would trust that brain to that kind of a decision, but it happens all the time. So anyway, so that is part of it that I wanted to talk about. The only other thing that I want to kind of throw in is where we are today. And so this decision, say 20, 30 years ago, was pretty much a no-brainer, right? So let's think about what the college decision is. It's a decision around building human capital, right? And it's a trade. We're trading money for a university that's going to help us build human capital. We'll be able to invest that in a future company that'll pay us, right? So we're the supply of labor, they're the demanders of labor. And that's the way the economic bargain kind of works. Well, back in my day, right? Well, I graduated, say 30-ish years ago. It was a no-brainer, right? It was the cost to achieve that human capital was well below, in my estimation, the benefit of that human capital. That's what's changed. So when you look at some of the financial or some of the statistical aggregates, the two things I look at is the average cost of college relative to inflation, to the actual average, say, salary received from a college educated person. And there has been a massive sort of gap that has generated, which is no surprise to anybody, I don't think. But the bottom line is the cost of college has gone up about anywhere from 2 to 3x over decades versus the actual increase in salary. So anyway, so to summarize all that, what it really means is instead of college being a no-brainer, today it is a big brainer. And you really do need to think about it a lot. So anyway, so that's what we're going to tee it up. That's what we're going to talk about today. And one of the other things, a little kind of qualification, both Mike and I are faculty members. I'm a faculty member at James Madison. Mike's a faculty member at Duke University. We are not admissions people. We get the students after they show up. We get the students after they've been filtered through our admissions, various relevant admissions processes, but we're not in any way involved in that. So just so you know, but we teach the students after they come through that admissions process. So anyway, so first, now let me just transition now. Thank you for bearing with me for making that introduction. So again, Mike Munger is a distinguished professor at Duke University. Mike is a professor of political science, public policy, and economics, and is widely known for his work on markets regulation and economics of friction. He is also the host of the podcast, The Answer is Transaction Costs. So welcome, Mike.
Well, thanks. Thanks very much. I certainly have always been interested in the problem of transaction cost. Transaction cost is to markets as friction is to physics. So in a physical system, suppose an engine, one of the things that a lot of energy comes in, we're burning gasoline, the piston's going up and down, but a fair amount of the energy in that system is dissipated into heat because of friction. And you can talk about the physics of frictionless surfaces, and of course that's more interesting as a math problem, but it's not very interesting as an actual problem if you were designing an engine. Problem is that an awful lot of economics is basically like the physics of frictionless surfaces. We talk about things as if there were no transaction cost. And the reason that my podcast is called The Answer is Transaction Cost is that I've come to realize that the answer to many things that we actually see in the world around us, if you want to say, I wonder why that's true. Well, the answer is transaction cost. So I have tried to many different questions, one answer. You should always start with that. Now, it doesn't answer every question, but it is a pretty good start. I have claimed there are a lot of definitions of transaction cost. Most of them are pretty complicated. I've claimed that there's three, and these are particularly relevant for the college decision, both the admissions problem and the application problem, where one should apply and where one should go. Those three categories are triangulation, transfer, and trust. Triangulation means we have to locate each other. We have to get information about each other. The sort of basic question of, is there some mutually beneficial exchange or cooperation that's possible? Transfer is that it has to be delivered, the service has to be delivered, and the payment has to be made in a way that doesn't use up too much of the payment. So there was an example, the Connecticut Turnpike, state of Connecticut, used to have toll booths. And you would throw a quarter in. Often you would have to wait for 20 minutes to throw a quarter in. Well, they did a study, and nearly 40% of the revenue from these toll booths was being used to pay the toll booth collectors. And so the state's not getting much revenue from this, but hundreds and hundreds of hours are being wasted every day for people standing in line to pay the coin so that the toll booth collectors could be paid, because they had to be able to make change. And so just get rid of that. And so that example writ large is one of the things that the problem of transfer cost tells you. If you can get rid of some of the impediments to that, there's an awful lot of services that people would be willing to pay for, because the cost of anything is the sum of the money cost and then the cost that you have to pay in order to acquire or have the thing delivered. And so the reduction in demand curve slope downward. Having a reduction in transfer costs is just like having a reduction in production cost. The difference is you get paid. If you can reduce the transfer cost, you actually get some of that additional money. Whereas if transfer costs standing in line are high, nobody gets that. It's just dissipated like friction. And then the third category is trust. I have to be able to rely on what you say you're going to provide. You have to be able to rely on what I say I'm going to provide. And that's a huge problem in college. The reason that we have grades, the reason we have SAT scores. So I'm a college admissions officer, which I am not, as you said. I don't know anything about that. I'm not but suppose I'm a college admissions officer. You send me a letter saying, I am a student and I am really awesome. And here's 2 letters that attest to my awesomeness. I could say, you're right, I'll admit you. But everyone says that, and not everyone is. And so we use test scores. We use other ways of trying to gauge whether or not that representation can be. So both sides, college is a two-sided market. We're looking for what people should want, and we're looking at who colleges should admit. It's a matching problem. And so transactions cost is a really big part of that. And I think it's a good way. It's not the only way. There's other approaches you should take, but it is a good way to start to think about this question.
So I love that that description. Thank you, Mike. And you know, it's funny, and you've heard me call it the triple T before, and I call it the triple T because it's a mnemonic that helps me remember what it is.
It was not an accident that I chose three T's to make it easier
Yes,
to remember.
absolutely. Just like the three P's of justice. So yeah, no,
It's
you're
actually the
great.
three TRs. So the three TERs.
The TERS. That's right. You get two there. But so what I wanted my first question, and one of the things that I spend time, so part of what, I'm a faculty member, I teach the decision making, but part of what my company does outside of me being a faculty member is we provide seminars to high school students, both in the Shenandoah Valley in Northern Virginia, and mostly in Virginia, we do that. And so we talk to the students about community college, right? And community college, the idea being that it's a less expensive alternative. It's a way to achieve that human capital, but at a lower price. So we talked to them about that as being, okay, we should be considering this as part of your process. But we talked about the triple T, and we talked about the cost of I believe it would be of triangulation, right? So more effort for research, coordinating, comparing transfer options. I mean, could you just discuss a little bit about how transaction costs would kind of come into the making the decision about will I be able, or should I consider community college as a viable alternative?
Big problem is that, and you said this, but I think it's useful to think of as an example. Russ Roberts is obsessed with the philosopher L.A. Paul, who used the example of what she called the vampire problem. And the vampire problem is, suppose that a friendly vampire comes up and offers to bite you in the neck and turn you into a vampire. Should you want to do that? Well, I have no way of knowing that, because once I'm a vampire, all of my tastes, literally in this case, because I will now want blood, will be changed. I will live forever, but I will be cold all the time. It's a completely different life. And
Right.
so Russ uses the idea of the vampire problem to describe a relatively few wild, or what you called super complex problems. Should I have children? Should I get married? And what college should I go to? Maybe to some extent, what career should I choose? But you have some sort of idea about that. Still, it is very hard to imagine what it would be like to evaluate the decision once you have been changed as a person. And the thing about college is you are going there to be changed as a person. So I've argued that one of the ways to think about the traditional sort of college is that it is actually a combination of four buildings. And those four buildings are the clock tower, the stadium, the fraternity or sorority house, and the admissions office. And they're bundled. They're all tied together.
Right.
So the clock tower, there's a kind of tyranny. It's strange, but my classes meet from 10:15 to 11:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, let's say. And so I've announced that learning will take place at those two times. That's really weird when you think about it,
Right.
because there's no reason that it should be synchronized and joined like that. Now, maybe it's good to have a class discussion. Maybe it's good to be in person, but you could imagine someone who's a way better teacher than I am offering a video. And
Right.
frankly, I'm a pretty darn good teacher. You are a pretty darn good teacher. There's a bunch
Right.
of people who have classes
Right.
from people that are not as committed to the presentation of information as we are. Many students would be better off with a video. Plus, they work, maybe they're on a sports team. They have all sorts of reasons
Right.
why the tyranny of the clock tower should be broken. But at universities, there is a tyranny of the clock tower. Learning takes place between 10:15 and 11:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and there are some reasons for that. There are traditions why, we go together in a group. We have a sage on the stage who tells us about things. The second, though, was the stadium. Students have a commitment, and human beings enjoy engaging in tribal behavior. And so one of the reasons that people come to Duke, I don't think there's any question about it, is because they want to be part of the Duke basketball experience. And when they get here, they may not be basketball fans. When they leave, they almost all are. There's a pretty good chance that sometime during your time at Duke, you will be in a Final Four, which is a unique experience. Now, you might say it has nothing to do with college. Well, it has everything to do with college because colleges bundle those things together. University
Right.
of Michigan, Ohio State, there's a bunch of other places that those things are all bundled together. The third is the fraternity house, the sorority house, maybe it's the college union. Colleges, big colleges where people live on campus, they're residential, are some of the best dating services anywhere. It is much better than an online dating service because all of the transactions cost of sorting. These are young people who are my age, they're interested in the same thing, and they're relatively wealthy. And I'm at a party with a few other people, the opportunities for me to meet someone are so much better. It's so much easier. It's so much of a
Yep.
less weird situation than it is trying to meet someone. Now, you can say that's not a part of college. You're kidding yourself if you think it's not.
It's
It
everything.
totally
Right.
is.
Yep.
And then the last is the admissions office. Now, Brian Kaplan at George Mason has taught. He said this is actually the only one that matters, and he's wrong about that. He's wrong about many things, but he's wrong about that. On the other hand, it's really important. So what the admissions office does is put people through a vetting process where they spend a lot of time comparing, making really small comparisons. At a place like Duke, dozens of hours are spent on every person who is finally admitted. Now, we get thousands and thousands of applicants, and that is whittled down by having people look at this. They do research. They often do interviews. So the fact that you got into a college that has high admission standards just automatically tells you something about that person. And so if I'm thinking of hiring someone and that's all I know, so I know that someone went to a community college and someone went to Duke,
Right.
the experiences that they have had are just different. And so as a result, there's a signaling component to that. Now, colleges combine those four things. People might value those four things in different ways. But as a whole, those four things gathered together are pretty important. So I would say that there's two bad ways to think about the college decision. One is what I want to try to do is to maximize my net rate of return in the short run because life is long and what your experience in college changes your life. You become a vampire. You
Right.
know things that you didn't even know you didn't know. You will talk about questions that have plagued philosophers for 3,000 years. And that's not because you want to make money. That's because it will just make you a better citizen of the world. And the way that you think about yourself will be changed. The other thing is to think of it purely as consumption. And what I wanted to say about this was when I went to college, I went to Davidson College, which is a small liberal arts school that people know because of Steph Curry, but it's a nice small
Yeah.
liberal arts college,
Yeah.
and
Love Charlotte.
it was the best school I got into,
Hmm.
and I borrowed some money to go there. The tuition was $4,500. So I borrowed a very small amount of money. I was able to work during the summer, and I had a National Merit Scholarship. I think I ended up with debt of $2,000 or $3,000, and I had a degree from Davidson College. And
Nice.
the one of the things that transactions costs teach us is that most of the time, if you spend very much time making the kinds of decisions that you described, making every day, you're going to go nuts, or else you're just going to waste a lot of time. We reduce those
Right.
things to habits.
Right.
And people who are successful financially and people who are financial failures, the main difference between them is the habits that they have developed, not
Right.
just differences in decision making, But from the time you're 10 or 11 years old, do you cultivate good financial habits or do you cultivate bad financial habits? Those things are cumulative. And it's shocking how big a difference they make. Most of the time, most decisions we make because we have decided or just accumulated experience about this is the way that I decide this thing, and I will decide it that way. College is not like that. It's for most people once in a lifetime. Now, maybe they can transfer, but to say that it's a consumption decision means that, and I may very well get in trouble for this. For many people, making it a consumption decision, if you have this caricature, I'm going to go to the best place that I got in, and it doesn't matter how much money I have to borrow.
Right.
And then I'm going to take the major, not that produces a career that I want to work, but that is the most interesting to me. You end up with one of these indignation studies majors. Many colleges have a variety of different indignation studies. And that's pretty, you get to be indignant with other people who are like you, and you read some things. That's not going to produce any sort of career except, and it is possible. There are some people who are paid to be indignant, but that's not
like news broadcasters or
something. Well, we don't need to name them. Everyone knows some people who are professionally indignant. That's a terrible idea. So the question is, how do you mix these two things? How do I make myself the sort of person that I want to be? And I can't be that unless I have some elements of a liberal arts education. We have known for a very long time that there's a set of things that an educated person needs to have just to be the sort of person that all of us want to be. The other thing is I need to have some skills that, I mean, you can say that it's because they're marketable, but what it really comes down to is, can I create value in the world? What you get paid for is creating value in the world. Now, that can be content creation. That can be, I can broker or give people advice about transactions. I can find new products that help us to cooperate. It's pretty big, but I need some sort of skills where I can create value for other people. The genius of the capitalist system is that each of us gets certificates for creating value for other people. So and these certificates have a specific name. They're called dollars. If I create value for other people, I get some of these certificates, and then I can say, look, I have these certificates, which I can then use to get something I myself value. But I can only do that if I've created value for someone else. And so I have to try to figure that out. So when you think about a college, when you think about a major, when you think an approach to this, there's a combination of two things that you actually can't know very well. One is, how can I make myself the sort of person that I think I want to become by the time I'm 30? And I can't travel forward to know that. That's a really hard problem. And the other is, how can I acquire the skills that in a rapidly changing world where what it takes to create value is hard to predict 5 or 10 years out? I need a general set of skills, not a particular set of skills. There's people who 7 or 8 years ago finished a major in graphic design. They're working as waiters now. There's no such thing as graphic design because of AI. It's gone. And so somehow you have to avoid that. So, and I don't know how you do that, because if I did, I wouldn't be a tenured professor. It's easy for me to say stuff like that because I basically have a job where I do no work, get paid a lot, and can't be fired.
What a gig. So I want to pull on a thread a little bit and kind of going back to community college a little bit. And let me tell you a story. So I used to be a managing director at KPMG, which is one of the big four accounting firms, accounting tax advisory. So I would call them a really good big box management consultant, right? Probably not at the level of, say, McKinsey or Booz or whatever, but still a very, very formidable, does a lot of work in the market, and generally has a good reputation. So as a result, we're able to hire a lot of people. So a lot of college graduates. And so my story is this. So I used to be, before I joined the faculty, I was actually a a lead recruiting partner for basically the Mid-Atlantic for KPMG at James Madison, right? And so we would, we would interview hundreds and hundreds of or upwards of thousands of it. We were a really big, JMU as other big state schools were a big part of what we did. And our approach was really pretty simple. It was, we looked at GPA, and we looked at major. And if you think about the approach, it's like everybody applies. We make our initial cuts without talking to anybody based on some very simple, legally defensible, sort of cutoffs, right? And so we
Which you
whittle down
have
to,
to do because of transaction cost. You could not
yes,
possibly spend the time that would be required. If you were robbed of those signals, this would basically be random.
right, absolutely. That it would be, and we find, and they're good.
Yeah.
They're not perfect,
No,
but
they're
they're
good
good.
on
And then,
average. They are statistically meaningful. It tells you
yes,
something.
absolutely. And then we take the big pool down to the small pool, we interview them. But I look at that as tie breaking, right? Like we already know they're actually really good. We just want to make sure. And then we hire them and we kind of go on down the road. But that's kind of the process, right? So, but there's an interesting observation, which is we would have a minority of candidates that would have gone through community college and transferred to JMU. Now, the local community college in the Shenandoah Valley is called Blue Ridge Community College. Most big publics sort of have a sister a younger sister sort of community college associated with it. Like George Mason has Nova, VCU has J. Sargent Reynolds. But anyway, that's kind of the way it works. So we had a subset of these candidates that came through. There's one observation I'll make on these folks. They passed all the criteria. They had the high GPAs. They had the right major. Um, but our experience was after we hired them, they made amazing employees. They stuck. They were high quality. They did great work, and they stayed around. And for a consulting firm like ours, the cost of attrition is massive. We spend so much time training that if you bring somebody in and they leave in 6 months, either because they left on their own or because, they got the boot because they weren't getting it done, that's a big cost. But it was a cost we just had to pay, and we did pay, and the math made sense for us. But my point in saying this, my biggest complaint to JMU or pretty much any other big university that has these community college transfers is there's never enough of them. Like if I could have hired more, you know, residential college grad from JMU that went through what I will call the resilience signal building community college process, we would hire more of them. There just weren't enough. And so my whole thing has always been, what's going on? Why can't we get more through that community college process? Because honestly, as a hiring manager, they were awesome.
I have no experience with that, and that is an interesting observation. From the college's perspective, they have to decide who to admit, and they get paid for enrollments.
Right.
And so that's a contract that the state has designed. And
Yes.
so that means that if they farmed out all those enrollments to someone else, their budget would be cut. Now,
Yes.
that's not a very good reason. It means they may not be
Yes.
serving the state as much as if
Right.
they were to have some alternative model. But if you want to change behavior, you'd have to change the incentives. And state universities are really stuck that way. So
Yes.
at Duke accepts transfers, almost certainly not from community colleges. I find that the transfer students are among the most interesting, partly because they're brave. These are
Right.
people that had some sort of plan. They're capable of coming up with the plan and executing it, particularly if they have a solid major, if they have chosen a major that
Right.
actually leads to something. So you're selecting on something difficult there. So someone goes to a community college, then they go, let's say in economics,
Right.
and then they go to James Madison and do well in the economics classes there. That person's smart and motivated. So you're selecting on something that's otherwise unobservable.
Right. Yeah, it's a signal. Absolutely.
I,
And I call it
it's
a
not
resilience signal. But
it's
yes,
not
you're
obvious to me that if James Madison allowed more community college transfers, that those people would have the same properties because they would probably
Right.
be lowering the standards.
Well, I
So
think you're exactly right because what I'm saying is they have a high GPA, they have the right major, and those majors are generally rigorous majors, right? Like accounting or mathematical finance, whatever it is. So it's not the average transfer, I
the
think
average
is your
person who
point.
asks to transfer and is turned down. So if JMU just lowered its transfer standards, it's not true that you would get more people. In fact, then the signal would probably just lose its value because you'd
Absolutely.
say
Yeah.
they're not as good. I don't know what happened. And the
Yeah.
answer is
Yeah.
they lowered their standards.
Right. Right. That's, yeah, like Goodhart's law or
Yeah.
something. Yeah. No, that makes, yeah, no, you're right. And
Now,
where I
it's
was, my
purely
head was,
speculation. That's purely speculation.
yeah. Well, no, but it makes sense actually. And where my head was going is you talked about bundling in that your four building model, and I think of community college as the debundled decision, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
you're getting gen eds, let's say, and that's it. There's no sports team, there's no social environment, there's no adulting other than having to show up to class. I guess
Yeah.
that's probably adulting, but other than that, there's not,
Well,
what a traditional residential college provides.
there's no fraternities or sororities. A lot of people, the kids don't know each other. There's little, it's called a community college. It's a college for the community, but there's not much community in the college because people are
Yes,
also working. But
right,
someone who can juggle all of these different tasks and succeed at it,
right,
if you were to come up with a test that would make them a successful employee at KPMG,
right,
and who would stay because they're not going to give up, this is pretty close to an
right,
ideal test. So I think it's an interesting question why it is that, well, the big problem that we have, I think, with the decision about college is two things. There are many majors and activities at college that now do not really lead to careers. And it partly is that's because colleges have abdicated their responsibility and said these people who actually don't know enough to know what they should want, we will create majors that sound like what they think they want. So we're
right,
just serving them cotton candy instead of broccoli. Used to be you had to eat broccoli. Now you can get cotton candy. At the end, that there's no nutrition in that. The other thing is that the price of college, I paid $4,500 at Davidson. I checked before this just to see tuition and fees are almost 80,000. So at nearly 20 times as much. And I'm old, but I graduated in 1980. So I graduated from college 45 years ago. So in
right,
45 years, we have increased by a factor of almost 20 the
yeah,
amount of tuition in order to go to, and in Davidson, it's the same place. I'm comparing apples and apples.
right,
Now, I think that many of the majors at Davidson are not now worth taking as a major unless you're so wealthy you just have a trust fund and none of this matters to you. But if you
right,
actually care about working and being a productive member of society, I don't know what you're doing in that major.
right.
So those two factors mean that there's a lot of minefields here. If you just say, I'm going to go to the best college I get into, and then I will make the finances work, I don't care how much it costs, you're heading for a major financial accident.
Right. And it's one of the things that really turned me on to this space was some research that I've done that, you've probably heard of survivorship bias before, right? Where there's an old story about an airplane that the airplane comes back and it's all riddled with holes. So they're like, oh, to make the plane better, we're going to cover those holes. Well, what they actually were measuring was, well, those holes are actually the ones that survived. What you really want to know is where were the holes in the planes that got knocked down,
It
right?
was
And
an actual that's an actual case where
right,
engineers were the losses were so high. The engineers said, "What can we armor? Armor's too expensive. We can't cover the entire plane." And so they looked carefully at all the planes that came back and then
right,
realized that wait,
wait, yeah,
that's actually the
yeah, the
if
wrong
there's a
sample.
hole, if there's a hole, it's a very useful sample.
Yeah,
If there's a hole and it came back, we don't have to armor that.
we don't yeah, don't cover that hole. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No. So, but the survivorship I'm talking about, the survivorship bias, or that sort of fun example or real example is so the way so the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I believe, puts out a series, at least when they're working. I think they're back to work now, but they put out this series about what they call like the value of education, and basically what it is it's a average unemployment rate and average salary based on level of education attained, right? So it goes from no high school, community college, undergraduate degree, master's degree, doctorate, that, and they show what you would expect, right? The slope of the line, lower, more education means less unemployment and more salary. Well, my whole thing is what I came to appreciate through the data was that survivorship bias, right? They are measuring outcomes of those that survived. And what I've come to figure out is so many students start college and don't survive. And they end up with massive amounts of debt and really poor outcomes. They don't get the jobs that they want, et cetera. So, to me, that measurement, it's a very flawed measurement because it's just measuring like a portfolio after the fact. And what you really want to do is measure who are they when they were high school seniors, and let's follow them at like a vintage analysis through the analysis to understand what they are. But when you do it that way, which we found the data to be able to do that, it shows a completely different story, right? It shows that really only about a third of Americans are able to graduate from college and get a good job that actually require, and what I'm calling a good job is a job that requires a college degree, right? So they're not a barista, and they have ways of measuring that. And even those also had debt. So only a third of them. The other two-thirds are going to not have jobs that require a college degree, have massive amounts of debt, are defaulting on debt, and are achieving just different levels of difficulty in their life. And what's sad to me is it's a very quiet group, right? They're carrying all this debt and just doing the best they can, trying to get to the end of their lives. But it's a real group of people, and to some degree, if you look at that measure of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is like to me, it's like a piece of marketing. It shows a great story, but it's also showing it's not entirely correct. And that's for me what kind of got me very interested in this problem, which is, wait a second, our own government is telling high school seniors and their parents that college is a great deal when the actual analysis itself suffers from survivorship bias. So anyway,
it's worse than survivorship bias, although you're certainly right that that's a problem. I don't think the reason that you should go to college is to get a career. I think the reason that you should go to college is to think about the problems that have plagued philosophers for 3,000 years and to be a better person by the time that you're 30. But you are right that the government is basically helping colleges, and I have to include Duke in that have very high tuitions, in perpetrating a fraud. And the fraud is that if you pay $80,000 a year and you have to borrow 3/4 of it, it's still worth it because look, the BLS shows that college is a great investment. Well, it's not, it shouldn't be. And for many people, it actually shouldn't be something that you even do. Suppose we said the same thing about cars, that I notice that people that drive really expensive cars tend to be really rich. Okay, should I borrow a lot of money to buy a car because then that will mean that I'm rich? No, that's actually an inverse. I notice that many of the kids at Duke are so smart, so self-possessed. The experience that they have is they could come to Duke and study underwater basketry for 4 years, and they would still be a success. I remember one kid in particular, he was sort of an economics major. He didn't do very well. He took classes, he hardly ever did any work. He was clearly extremely bright, and in the summer he would do amazing internships. He ended up being a vice president at Microsoft. He was there for the other experiences. His family was extremely wealthy. They didn't borrow anything.
right.
That's the sort of person who's really rich already and buys a Maserati.
Right.
You should not borrow money to get a Maserati. You're confused about cause and effect. So it's actually true. So that you said that it's survivorship bias. It's also selection bias. I think both of those things are
Right.
true. A lot
I
of the
think you're right.
people at Duke, Harvard, Yale, they're going to succeed
Right.
because they started out on third base. They have an understanding of what takes in the world. They have a set of contacts, and that's great. Good for them. I don't begrudge it. But
Right.
it does not mean that this one thing that they did, which was go to a top college and pay $400,000, that's not the thing that did it. So combination of survivorship bias and strong selection bias, which doesn't mean that if I
Right.
buy a Maserati, I'll be rich. In fact, I'll be impoverished.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things we share with students with high school, and we do parent programs and we talk to them, and one of the things we try to do is we try to put opportunity costs into context that makes sense to people, because I actually think opportunity cost is kind of a tricky thing to get your head around if you're not an economist. So
Well, it's a tricky thing for everyone. It's one of the most important concepts of economics, and we do a terrible job teaching it.
I'm with you. So my approach. So what I do is, and I think of opportunity costs, like in the example we were just talking about, whether or not somebody had to pay to go to college or whether they had to get a loan, right? So what we're talking about, but let's just take the loan out of the situation. Let's say you have all the money in the world, or your parents do, and you're making the decision between going, and I won't use Duke, let's say Drexel, that is an expensive school as well. Say that's about $80,000 a year, or you're a Virginia resident and you can go to JMU and maybe get out of there for about 25 or $30,000 a year. So what I show them is, let's just say you could take that difference between 30,000 and $80,000. And let's just assume those are the rack rates. Maybe nobody pays that, but let's just use those as the standards here. You can take that difference, multiply it by 4, and you can invest it for 40 years. So you'll end up with a nest egg of around $5 to $6 million at a reasonable investment rate in a diversified fund. That's what I show them. So the question isn't, should I go to this school or that school because it's like, quote unquote, better school or more selective or has a better name. It's more, do you think you're going to get $5 million of value out of that by the time you retire? And nobody looks at it that way, right? And to me, that's the ultimate long-term opportunity cost, right? Which is, if you're paying a lot more, both schools could be good. And you know what, part of this too, and to be fair, Mike, part of my perspective is also my KPMG perspective as a hiring manager, right? For us, it literally didn't matter whether you went to JMU or to Drexel or to Harvard even. The problem with Harvard is they're too small. Like we just needed too many people. The great thing about JMU is we had a bunch of accounting and finance majors with 3.8 and above, and we could hire them, right? And we had client needs. We could bring them in. We could put them through the KPMG process. They became productive, successful, etc. So for us, the difference between a state school and a selective school was almost nil. I'm just saying. And so that's where my head kind of goes back to that example of, for the parents. It's like, okay, what is your purpose? Part of your purpose should be to get a job, I think. Maybe, we can maybe argue that. And I think part of it is also to become a better person, to learn to adult, right? To learn to take care of yourself. I mean, there's a lot of purposes. The question is, does a state college versus a selective college do that much better job in those things if, at least on the hiring side, a firm like, the big four firms don't actually hire any differently based on those two different schools. And what's interesting too, by the way, just a little tidbit, we have pretty hard cutoffs for GPA, right? And part of that is actually because of the Equal Employment Opportunity Act and Civil Rights Act. Using GPA is defensible, and we have to be very careful. So if we're hiring from a bunch of all white colleges, right, it just gets really tricky. So GPA for us is just this really safe way of saying, okay, regardless of any other thing, as long as you have this GPA, you're going to be pretty good. So the funny thing I want to bring up is, so as a result, if you went to Harvard and got a 2.8, we would never see you. If you went to a really good state school like a JMU, Virginia Tech, et cetera, or UVA, and you got a 3.5, we would be hiring you every day, 7 days a week, and on Sunday or whatever. So that was always an interesting thing to me as well, just in terms of sort of how the hiring really worked. And again, my example with these different firms, their relationship with the selective colleges.
Well, two things. One is there are entire departments at Duke where the median GPA is 4.0. They've never given anything except an A. The overall GPA average at Harvard is 3.8. So
Okay.
when you hypothetically, yes, if there were someone with a 2.8, you wouldn't hire them. There's no unicorns or flying pigs either. So
Yeah.
the one of the things that top colleges give you is a guarantee that you'll have a 4.0. And so I've had students be very upset with me because they got an A minus, and that means that they're now in the bottom half of the grade distribution at Duke. And so GPA has become meaningless at the top schools because it has become sort of a fraudulent. I think it's fraudulent because GPA should have information. The professors say these students are really smart and I'm a good teacher. Why would I give them anything but an A? Because they're really smart and I'm a good teacher. And
Well,
so I worry
well, can
that
I ask you
GPA,
something, Mike? Just
please.
just real quick, just as a professor, how do you give them feedback? Like, is there the ability, or do you? Like what I'm hearing you say, that sounds like the easiest job in the world. I teach, do my thing, they turn something in, they just get an A. I don't even need to look at it. But I don't think that's the way it is, right? I mean, there must be, if the grade isn't the signal, do you have other mechanisms for saying, hey, look, I gave you a good grade, but here are the challenges?
Well, I give a midterm and a final, and the grades on my midterm are often the mean is often in the 60s, and I give grades and comments on papers. So I'm talking about final grades for the semester.
Got it.
And so
Okay.
the charade is that you give pretty hard grades all through the semester and then give an A at the end. That's the way to get good teaching evaluations because they think, boy, I worked really hard. That was a fair final grade. Yes, some of the hard part in the middle was difficult. So you can give feedback in individual projects. And
Okay.
I gave a C last semester.
Got it.
I think that's kind of unusual. But in equilibrium, Duke's, well, let me say this, because you made a comparison and I understand it. Your premise is suppose people have all the money in the world. They have enough money that they can pay for this. If they go to Duke or Harvard, their classes are a different sort of person. Now, the smartest people at James Madison are as good as the same as the people at Duke or Harvard. There's just a whole bunch of other ones too.
Absolutely.
And
No
people
doubt.
rise or fall to the level of the people around them.
Right.
And so a very smart person who goes to James Madison is going to have the impression that they're doing quality work, and they are not. They're not actually playing against the first team.
Right.
So the reason, if you have all the money in the world, that calculation about opportunity cost is misleading is that you're not going to college to get a job in the first place. And in fact, because you have a trust fund, you could just go and have the experience of being in college. I'm going to talk about Aristotle and Plato with some other really smart people, and then I'm going to go live at the family beach house.
Right.
It's the borrowing to me. I think the borrowing is actually essential. So the question of opportunity cost is a very difficult one. And it happens all the time. Let me now make an argument in favor of your side. I have a lot of students who say they've graduated, they're about to graduate from Duke. They're considering going to law school. And I say, why? Why would you do that? They're going to go to a top law school. They're going to have to borrow quite a bit of money to do it. And they say, well, I can get a better job. Wait, stop, don't. You're
But
going to
can
pay
you?
$70,000 for 3 years and you're not going to work. So you could work maybe at KPMG for three
Right.
years and earn a pretty good salary. And so let's say that your pay at KPMG is 75,000 and you're not paying 70,000.
Right.
So
And
that's
borrowing. Yeah,
So
right.
the difference in your wealth position at the end of that time is well over $400,000. That's not present value. That's now.
Right.
And then where you'll be working, you'll have 3 years experience. You'll probably have progressive improvements. And so they're comparing apples and oranges because they haven't thought about that opportunity cost question. It's just as if the 3 years salary and the 3 years tuition about going to law school don't count. So you should always think in terms of opportunity cost if you are wealth constrained. The question is, if you're not wealth constrained, what is it that you actually want out of life? And that's the vampire problem.
Right.
I don't know that you can actually think what it is like. I had one son go to Duke and one son go to UNC. Duke's very expensive. My son, who went there, was an indifferent student. He was just very smart. He was the captain of his high school crew team. He had a bunch of other qualities, and so he got into Duke. He actually wanted to go to UNC, but did not get in. He got into Duke. And UNC is a flagship state school in North Carolina. It is one of the public Ivies. It's a very good school. At the time, tuition at UNC was $6,000 per year, and tuition at Duke was $70,000 per year. So I had kind of a controlled experiment in seeing the experience of these two people. My younger son, who went to Duke, always rose or fell to the level of the people around him. He was in a fraternity, and when he was a freshman, had a visitation from the members of his fraternity saying, "You're not doing very well in class. You need to study more because you're bringing down our fraternity GPA, and we don't like that."
Wow.
So having a group of peers that said, "You suck, you have to work harder," would not have happened if he had gone to UNC or, forgive me, JMU, because he would have been doing fine. So
Right.
it's just a different thing. If you can pay for it, it's worth a lot. It's not worth a lot of money, but it changes your life. The other son, who is now a professor at University European European University Institute in Florence, Italy, never cared what other people did. He majored in math and economics. He was always at the top of everything that he did. UNC was great for him. So that's basically free by the standards of college now. In-state tuition is very close to free for most people. You can probably work, save a little bit, borrow a little bit, and get through if you're careful. So
Hmm.
I think really the bottom line here is this depends on your wealth position and what it is that you want out of college. So I would defend the liberal arts sort of approach for many people, but you can go to, having said that, you can go to UNC, you can go to James Madison, and if you know what you want,
Right.
you can be part of an elite. They have honors colleges. People need to
Right.
think about what their options are. So,
Right.
and it is absolutely what I said before is absolutely true. I'm sorry this is so long, but I have a
Right.
lot of thoughts about it. The best people at JMU are every bit as good as the
Right.
best people at Duke. And if you are in
100%.
small classes with them, you should go to JMU. You
Right.
absolutely should. Because the opportunity cost of going to Duke, being in large classes where you're not taking advantage of what a place like Duke can do, there, of course, the 5 or 6 million makes all the difference. You have to think, what is it that I want and what am I capable of? Am I a self-starter? Am I able
Right.
to organize my own life? And am I able to develop habits? Or like my younger son, do you need someone else to create those habits for you? Because that's what top schools can do.
Well, you bring up a really interesting point about, the top student, sort of thinking there. And it's interesting because we do these high school programs and we'll put them through the process of developing their criteria and then, weighing their criteria, kind of building their at least their first cut at their own personal utility model. But invariably, school size comes up. Like, I want to go to a small school. And I think part of it is really that the message there is I'm uncomfortable. And I feel like if it's small, more like my high school, it'll just feel better versus if it's big, it's just feels worse. But
Well,
not
I'll get
really,
lost. I'll get
or
lost.
I'll
I
get
won't have
lost.
a community.
But my point is, schools like JMU, but I think most big schools, whether they're public or private, have kind of figured out how to create small communities within the big community, right? So, like, if you go to New York City, you're not just going to New York, you're going to Hell's Kitchen. or whatever, you know. So people don't really, you know, yes, you're going to the big university, but you're going to find your Hell's Kitchen or whatever. And to your point, like JMU, like I'm sure, but all big colleges do have, they absolutely have honors colleges. They absolutely have majors that like, you know, my youngest son David went to James Madison. He's what's called quantitative finance or QFIN. They graduate like 5 to 10 students a year,
And
and
they're
they all go
fantastic.
straight and they
They
all
are
go straight to
fantastic.
Wall Street,
Yeah,
right?
they're as good as anybody.
And it's a wonderful program,
Yep.
etc. So, but my point is, but there's a lot of kids that don't go QFIN, obviously,
Most
because
most
almost all
don't,
of them don't.
and they get lost.
Right. But there is a, you know, again, my point is more, um, for somebody choosing a school, if you're worried about the size, you actually, once you get to know a larger school, I think what you're going to find is it gets small pretty quick. If you find your thing, whatever your thing is, if you're into club soccer, go play club soccer. If you're into underwater basket weaving, get into the basket weaving club or whatever. So I don't know. That's just been my experience. And I think it's been a survival thing for schools like JMU because they're like, wait, you know, we've got to find a way to create community, even though at 22,000, you're like, wow, that's a lot of people.
It is a lot of people. One of my first teaching job was at Dartmouth, which is relatively small. My second teaching job was the University of Texas at Austin, which has 53,000 students. And I taught the class that I taught was Introduction to American Government, 1,400 students. Texas has a rule that anyone who is in the top 10% of their graduating class and got at least 1,000 on the SAT automatically gets admission to UT Austin. And my job was to flunk 40% of the people, 40% of the people in that class. And I did not have to have a curve.
Wow.
So many of these kids got to Austin, the big city. They'd gone to a small high school in West Texas.
Right.
We had to flunk them out. There's not enough dorm space, but they would make a 30 on the midterm and then maybe not show up for the final because they're just lost. So not everyone is well suited. You have to be able to be confident enough to find your community. Now, I'm sure that it's true that schools have gotten better at that because legislatures have put pressure for retention.
Right.
So you're not supposed to give bad grades. You're supposed to keep them around and maybe have some sort of community to find it. Not everybody is good at that. You might want to try to think about a smaller school. There are some relatively inexpensive smaller schools. And there's also a lot of, one of the things that you probably should think about if you're thinking about applying to college is if you can't afford it, go ahead and apply and see what sort of offer they'll make. Because there's a lot of price discrimination. But the thing is, if they're offering loans, that's just a fake. You wouldn't buy the Maserati if they say, "Well, we'll give you a discount. We'll loan you $90,000."
Yeah, right.
That's not real.
Exactly.
You want to give me grants, you want to make it possible for me to come, we'll talk. If you want to give me loans, thanks. No hard feelings, but I'm not coming there.
Right. But you know, it's funny. I liken, you mentioned price discrimination, and to me, it's a level of first degree price discrimination on par with used car dealers.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
It's kind of the same thing. It's presented differently. It's experienced differently than walking onto a used car lot.
Really
but
is.
It's really not that different.
They should be wearing plaid, a white belt, and white shoes because when you say it's presented differently, sure, but it's a lie. It's the same thing. They have two questions. How much money do you have?
Right.
And how much of it can I get? And so they're trying to figure, and that's just what a used car salesman is doing.
100%. And they size you up. I mean, it's all it's exactly the way that works. So yeah,
because
it's an interesting.
Their marginal cost is not very high. So the particularly for a lot of the smaller liberal arts schools right now, they're under capacity by 20%.
Yeah.
And if they can get you to pay $10,000 or $12,000, great. But that means you have to negotiate. But the positive message here is, if you're interested in a small liberal arts school and you look at the tuition, I can't pay that. Well, you won't have to.
Yeah.
And then just don't go. If they don't make you an offer that you can make work, don't go. But don't rule it out in advance. Make that one of your options.
Yeah. No, I agree. No, that's all very good stuff, Mike. And this has been a lot of fun, and my conversations with you are always very fun. So I appreciate your thoughts. I appreciate the connection to transaction costs. I think college decision making, like Russ says, it's a wild problem for sure. It's a very challenging one, and certainly transaction costs are in it in a very big way. But before we wrap up, are any finishing thoughts you'd like to share? Especially around people that may be getting ready to, that have that 17-year-old. Where are we now?
The thing that I tell people is that when you apply to a college, and Duke is terrible for this, they say, well, so what are you going to major in? What courses do you want to take? You have to cultivate the power of what I call the IDK. That is, I don't know.
Right.
So the Duke students compete on this bizarre BS narrative. I'm going to cure cancer. I'm going to start 3 nonprofits in Africa, and then I am going to go to law school. You don't know any of that. You don't know what your major is going to be. And so when you go to college, you have an opportunity to sample some courses, and you may be very surprised that one of these things that you had an impression of from the way that it was taught in high school probably is completely different. Economics and finance are 2 examples of that. If those things are taught by someone who can explain it, they're actually intrinsically interesting. And it can be something that you can make a big part of your life. So the fact that you didn't like them in high school, unsurprisingly, they're better taught in college. So try to go in with an attitude that I am going shopping. I am going to decide intellectually what my life is going to be, rather than get hooked into some kind of narrative that then entraps you. So one of the reasons to go to a general purpose kind of college is that you have more of an opportunity for that. But to be fair, you can also do that in a community college. You can do some pretty inexpensive shopping. So maybe you're working part-time or full-time, you're taking some classes at night. Take some classes that you hadn't really thought about, maybe psychology or other things that you think, this is great, this is terrific.
Right.
So give yourself a chance rather than from the beginning trying to over specialize. And I think having that liberates you, because there's this pressure to say, oh, I know what I'm going to do. Because everyone else, if I talk to them, they say they know what they want to do. They don't. They're lying.
They're
So
lying.
when
Yeah.
you say, I don't know, you will see this respect
Right.
in their eyes. And I've had students 5 years later saying, that's some of the most important advice I ever got,
Right.
because I could actually, somebody said, here's what I'm going to do. And I said, yeah, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm at one of the world's great liberal arts universities, and I'm going to take advantage of that for 2 years. And they just get this sort of envy. Gosh, I wish I could say that.
Right. No, that's awesome. And the what I see, just to go a little bit different direction, but similar, I see that the psychology of what I call FOMO, or the fear of missing
Yeah.
out. And it's sort of what you just said. It's like, think about it. It's a bunch of high schoolers. One kid got into, let's say, Harvard. One kid sort of knows what they want to do. Well, what am I missing out on, right? And it almost creates this weird sort of wicking towards in a direction that, if they had some good advice, I think is what you're saying, they would say, I'm not missing out on anything. They don't actually know. Good for them, they got into Harvard. It's good for them, I hope.
Yeah.
It might not be good for me. I need to figure that out. And so
I go to James Madison, let's say I go and visit, and I see that there are some communities I'd like to be a part of. Within 2 years, I will have become the person that belongs in that kind of community. And for the rest of my life, I'll be glad I went to James Madison University. So for many, many people, if they go in with that kind of open attitude, I'm looking for a community that I can build something around for my college experience, that's the thing to do, rather than say, I have to go to the best college and then find whatever I can do to get through it financially. That's a terrible idea, because you end up happy and bankrupt. I'm unhappy, sad,
unhappy,
miserable, and bankrupt.
Right. Yeah, lose. Absolutely. Well, Mike, this has been a whole lot of fun. Now, in terms of connecting with you, we talked about your podcast. Is that the best way to follow up, or what?
Well, I always post things about my podcast on my Twitter, or now X account, which is just Mungowitz, Mungowitz. I did it in 2008 before Twitter was a thing. I just never thought much about the name, and so that was almost 20 years ago. But that's my Twitter
That's the
account.
name.
And
Okay.
I would recommend listening to Russ Roberts' podcast, Econ Talk, which you've already talked about. But for many people, if they're interested in an introduction to different aspects of economic and finance, there's a whole lot of hour-long uh, episodes there where you can learn a great deal about the sort of thing that will help you get through the IDK problem. You'll learn, maybe I want to do something like this. And I have 50 appearances on that. So if you wanted to
Yeah.
connect with me through Econ Talk, that would be fine.
Right.
But the
Well,
Mungowitz is the Twitter account, and you can see all sorts of
okay.
things there.
Very good. Well, thanks again, Mike, and we'll hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to you soon. Take
I
care.
really appreciate it.
All right.